Hello and welcome. My name is Doug Bosch. I am a professor here at Rhode Island College. I've been here since 2001. My primary role is head of foundations area, the freshman area of the art department. And we're going to give you a tour today of my exhibition titled Apparati. And I'll tell you a little bit about the name. Apparati is it's kind of a fictional name. The hope is that it conjures up images of an apparatus. The hope is that it sounds a little Italian, and the hope is that it sounds a little Latin, because I am hoping to invoke early primitive science and to bring it into the art arena for your pleasure. There are two things I think to point out here with this. One, it's some of its materials and its configuration are modeled on some early 18th century devices that were used for demonstration models to display often principles of physics to an audience. They would often contain backgrounds and framing that was overly ornate to kind of almost aestheticize the act that would take place within the device, to sort of deliberately marry art with science. So that's one part of what I'm doing here, is kind of being a little excessive with the framing and the backdrop. Secondly, I'm playing with a device that I love to play with, which is the catenary. And the catenary is it is the position that a string takes when it is at rest. If you hold it at 2 points, it will always take a predictable shape. That we call the catenary. It's kind of ubiquitous, it's very common, you'll see it everywhere, in power lines, for example, but it's a shape that has drawn me for a long time. I find it beautiful, simple, and graceful. So I'm trying to sort of marry two of my interests here in this piece, and to create a simulation that this device will do something. It looks like it has physical motion. It looks like somewhere there must be a lever that would activate it. But it does none of those things. It's all implied. It is intentional to try to get that tension or even frustration between something that appears to have a function, a utility, but which I know, and I am confessing to you, is completely futile. These devices that I've sort of conjured up, they don't do anything, but they look like they could. To me, that is part of my muse, that sort of, that tension of being at an in-between place, making these little sculptures that appear to have purpose and certainly point back to early scientific instruments that did have purpose, but at the same time admitting that they don't. But in the mind of the viewer, the hope is that you'll be caught in this in-between place where you will look at the work, you'll know that it doesn't do anything, it doesn't plug in, it doesn't make a sound, but you can't stop thinking that it probably could. Well, not all, but most of these, the black ones at the bottom, this white one, and the black and red ones on the top, are all inspired by my study of early battery forms. And what first drew me to early battery forms was the kind of rhythm of the parts, the cadence, there's a lot of repetition. There are blades that sit in liquid, but then the spacing on those blades it forms a rhythm that's very attractive to me, and I've always been attracted to stacks and patterns like that. But in the context of wanting to make a body of work that was relative to early science, I also was drawn to the surface and the patina on these artifacts. Many of them have crystallized surfaces, that they are corroded metals, and there is an allure for me in that it's a material that absorbs light more than it reflects it, and so there's kind of a mystery about that surface. So most of my works that intend to invoke that early battery influence are composed of carbon that I mix. It's powdered carbon. You know it as graphite powder, but graphite powder is a very pure form of carbon. But I mix it into a slurry until it's almost a yogurt consistency. And then I can dip it, or I can dip things into it, I can paint it onto surfaces so that I can get that sort of light absorbing, high texture surface that is so common with the early battery forms. The relationship varies as you might expect from one piece to the next. It's not always the same correlation or the same ratio. Some borrow more heavily, some less heavily. But I do want there to be a direct correlation. I want the opportunity in a context like this, or when giving a lecture, to actually refer to these scientific devices and to be able to post little information panels alongside my work. I want the viewer to know that there is a real historical scientific impetus behind the work. So I want that connection to be somewhat direct, but as I say in my exhibition statement, I don't want to make replicas, so I don't want to just copy them. So I suppose from piece to piece, that equation varies a little bit. In some cases, I might borrow quite heavily from the original source, but in others, only small percentages. And certainly in those cases, like with the battery series, there are several spread around the gallery. This is a series that has been going on for probably 3 years. I think at this point I've made almost a dozen pieces that are sort of drawing on that early battery influence. So for that reason, I can't borrow the same amount for each one, that they have to sort of mutate as the series goes on. And so as the series goes on, I begin to take more and more liberties with how much or how little I borrow. These are a tricky one. Usually the pieces you see in the gallery, they go from conception to prototype to construction to finalization in a series of no more than 3 months. But with Arc Lucerna, this is a 3-year project, and I can't exactly explain why, but most artists will know that there are some pieces in their portfolio that just take longer to gestate. Like they sit over in a corner and they just sort of percolate, and they just need more time than others, and this is one of them. So the original, oops, that one moved. The original, this is the first of the series, came about after studying a series of arc lamps, devices that would create these intense flashes of light that were early forms of a source of light. So you can kind of see a nod to that sort of thing. You know, there's this suggestion of a burning element and a dish that catches the fallout. But really, the whole piece really began with this little guy, which is a found object. It's a little box of metal rods that really set all of the other parts in motion. But as this one, over the course of a year, began to really take final form, it occurred to me that it needed a companion. And then after building another companion, I realized it needed a third. And so although, yes, this idea probably began almost 3 years ago, it wasn't the series did not get finished until about a month ago. And it reached a point where this one was the first to be finished, and the other two sort of came up at different degrees. I'd work on one, then I'd work on the other, but I always kept them in the company of one another so that they would read as a group. But they are meant to sort of draw on that early phase in science where there was an attempt to find a source of sustainable ignition and luminescence, therefore Arc Lucerna. So my hope is, and I do have a lot of friends who are engineers and scientists, so I kind of bounce these ideas off of them, and And I am looking, as I talk about my plan or my attempt here with the works, I look for that little spark in their eye when I can get them to go, I know what you're talking about. There's this instrument at the Harvard Museum that I look at, and I know what it does, but I mostly like how it looks. And then I realize, yes, we're on that same level. We have that same sort of admiration for aesthetic that goes beyond function and purpose. I was talking recently with an engineer friend of mine who was looking at the catenary drawing, and with his engineering mind, the first thing he went to was, how did he produce this drawing? Like, what kind of contraption did he devise to make the lines so constant? And I won't reveal how all of that plays out, but my conversation with him was a pure joy, just to see artist and engineer coming together to kind of look at this idea of a catenary from two different angles, but still arrive at the same place. Artists, we are entertainers, so it's one thing to have an idea and to be infatuated with it on our own, but we do have an audience. So for me, the benefit of making a model is for me to get a shape or an idea out of my head into the real world, but then also to step out of my individual desire to see a thing come into existence and step into the role of the viewer, the audience, and to gauge from a theatrical sense or even just a palpable sense if what's turning around in my head actually has any sort of stage presence or pedestal presence or floor presence. So for me, the making of the model it's a translation. It's converting idea into form. It is then seeing how the form lives in the world, even with regard to light, like what kind of shadows does this make? And how does it position itself in a gallery, on a wall, on a floor, leaning against the wall, hanging against the wall, just trying to gauge sort of the theatrical benefit of the catenary ideas in different locations. So that's part of my goal, is just wanting to really maximize the potential for the viewer from an entertainment standpoint. But then also, it's helpful to me to treat the models as a rehearsal. They're sort of micro versions of what I think I will make. So it lets me play out process, it lets me play out proportions, materials, and even though it's small and in my hand, it's easy for a sculptor to scale that up and to be making a little model with some modest materials, but already be able to know how that will be scaled up to more permanent materials. And then also the benefit of the models is to see how, in a scenario like this where I'm creating variations on an idea, how they look in the company of one another, how one model is or is not in discourse with another, so that, again, maybe sort of in a theatrical or arena sense, you can see whether or not there's energy jumping back and forth between the different ideas and the different models. It is titled Inverted Field, so I wanted to make it obvious that it's upside down. But when you look about the gallery, you'll see that nearly all of the pieces completely lay themselves bare. They're just completely open. Even when they're under a case, you can tell that they're engineered to be readily available to the eye. And that's generally my modus operandi. I mostly want to lay everything out and make it quite accessible. But in thinking about this show and thinking about the experience for the viewer, I did want to have this little exception to that rule where the piece actually sort of turns its back on the viewer and doesn't immediately give itself up, causing you to, you know, sort of be compelled to bend down and look up from underneath and just question why, when all the others are so immediately available, is this one not? Just to create a little tension there. Well, the one to my left here is titled galvanometers. I don't, you know, this is maybe one of a small number of works in the show that are actually named after a device. But galvanometers, I'm really referring to the small green component here. The black components are meant to reference or be suggestively battery forms. But this is one of the few pieces where we were talking earlier about how much do I borrow from the original source. This is one that borrows more heavily than others. It is definitely taking some direct cues from early galvanometer forms, the whole connection of using the brass tubing and the brass harness, even down to the little needle inside, suspended inside of the galvanometers. This is very typical of what you will see in an actual scientific instrument. So this one was always intended to pay sort of more direct homage to the original source. This guy to my right, you know, I said earlier in our talk that to make mere replicas is not so much of interest to me, but this one is almost a replica. There is, in the Museum of Natural History in London, there is a collection, there's one device in the mineralogy room that looks very similar to this. So this one really started off as just wanting to mimic something that I was really attracted to. And even in the Museum of Natural History in London, the object is also malachite. So it is exactly the same material. In the museum, what is underneath the malachite are metal rods, but underneath this one is paper. So I'm kind of trying to replicate it just to understand it. Originally, when I was building this, it was not intended to be a sculpture. It was me just tinkering with one of my source materials in hopes of understanding it better and figuring out how I would like to use it. I ran out of time for this exhibition, but this eventually will evolve into a series of works where I begin to take more and more liberties with the form and the materials. But I'm pretty sure that every piece in this series will be coated in malachite. Yeah.
You ready, Quinn? Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much for joining us today, and we hope you'll come visit us here at Bannister Gallery at Rhode Island College. Apparati is on view until March 18th.